Ladies and gentlemen, if you enjoy my video, please click the like button and share the video. It is the only way the YouTube algorithms really notices me. I will be very grateful to you. The wind carries the screams of the past. Scary story published by Scare Fiction. Read for you by Scare Fiction. Chapter 1. The Return to Willow Creek. The tires of Claire Donovan's rental car crunched over the gravel as she drove into Willow Creek, the town she had left behind 15 years ago. Place hadn't changed much. Same peeling paint on the old gas station, same sagging porch on the general store. But the wind was different. It was always the wind. As she stepped out of the car, a cold breeze swept through the trees, carrying with it a faint whisper. Claire shivered, pulling her coat tighter around her. The sun had barely dipped below the horizon, yet the shadows seemed longer here, darker. She could almost hear the town's ghostly voice in that wind, a voice she had tried to forget. Willow Creek was a small, forgotten town, nestled against the edge of the dense pine hollow forest. The wind that blew through those towering trees had always been strange. When she was a child, it had scared her how it seemed to carry whispers, or sometimes cries. Now, standing here again, Claire wondered if those memories were just her imagination. But as she looked around, she saw the haunted expressions on the few people still on the streets, and a pit of unease formed in her stomach. She was here for a reason, though. The call from Ethan, her childhood friend, had been brief. He hadn't said much, just that something terrible had happened, and she needed to come back. Now she understood why. A woman was dead. Margaret Quinn, a local who had lived on the edge of town near the forest. Claire didn't know her personally, but the story was on everyone's lips. They said Margaret had been found in her backyard, eyes wide open, her face frozen in terror. And they said that, on the night she died, the wind had howled louder than ever, carrying with it the sound of screams. Claire's journalist instincts kicked in. She had covered crimes and tragedies in cities far bigger than Willow Creek, but this felt different. Here, the wind seemed to breathe life into the town's secrets, carrying the past along with it. She didn't want to be here. The memories were already pressing in of the night she had fled this place, of the things she had tried to leave behind. But something about the way the wind tugged at her hair, whispered in her ears, made her realize she couldn't ignore it. As the sun set and the wind picked up, Claire made a decision. She would find out what really happened to Margaret Quinn, no matter what it cost her. But deep down, she feared that unraveling this mystery might mean confronting her own buried past, a past she wasn't sure she was ready to face. The wind moaned through the trees, almost as if it were laughing. Chapter 2. Whispers of the Past. The wind didn't let up that night. As Claire lay in the small bed of her childhood home, the old Donovan house groaned under its relentless assault. The creaking wood, the rattling window sounds she hadn't heard in years. But it wasn't the wind that kept her awake. It was the screams. She could still hear them, faint but unmistakable, echoing in her mind. Margaret Quinn's death wasn't an isolated incident. Claire knew it. Something connected it to the town's history, something dark that had been buried deep. The next morning, she decided to dig. The local library was as dusty and forgotten as the rest of Willow Creek. As Claire pored over old newspapers and town records, a pattern began to emerge. Every few years, there were reports of strange deaths, disappearances, all centered around the wind. Each time, the stories were whispered about for a while, then quickly buried. But it wasn't just the town's past that haunted her. The more she read, the more she felt the wind's presence. It wasn't just a force of nature, it was something alive, something that watched and waited. As she left the library, clutching a handful of notes, she ran into Ethan. He looked older than she remembered, his eyes hollow, his face drawn. They hadn't spoken much since she arrived, but now he seemed eager to talk. "Claire," he said, his voice low, "you need to stop digging. This town, it has secrets. Secrets that should stay buried." Claire narrowed her eyes. "What do you know, Ethan? What happened to Margaret?" He hesitated, glancing around as if the wind might overhear him. "It's the same as before. Every time someone starts asking questions, the wind, it takes them. Just like it did with Margaret." Claire's heart pounded in her chest. "What do you mean, takes them?" Ethan shook his head. "I can't explain it, but I've seen it. We all have. That wind, it's not natural. It carries more than just air. It carries the past, the screams of those who were lost." That night, the wind returned with a vengeance. Claire tried to sleep, but the whispers wouldn't let her. They called her name, soft at first, then louder, insistent. She sat up in bed, her pulse racing. Shadows danced on the walls, shifting and swirling, as if the wind had crept inside. Claire squeezed her eyes shut, but the whispers only grew. They weren't just random noises. They were voices familiar, accusing. Her mother's voice, her father's. Her breath hitched as she forced herself to listen. The voices merged with the wind, growing louder until they drowned out all other sound. The memories she had tried so hard to bury clawed their way to the surface. She could see their faces, hear their screams, screams that the wind had carried away, screams that had never really left. And then, just as suddenly, it stopped. The wind died down, leaving behind an eerie silence. But the damage was done. Claire knew she couldn't turn back now. The wind had shown her a glimpse of the truth, and it terrified her. She had to find out what the town was hiding. But as she stared out the window at the dark, whispering trees, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. Something that didn't want the truth to come out. The wind was coming for her, and she wasn't sure she could outrun it. Chapter 3. The first clue. The silence of the night hung thick in the air, but Claire knew it wouldn't last. The wind was always lurking, waiting. When the whispers finally subsided, exhaustion pulled her into a restless sleep filled with fractured images, her mother's tear-streaked face, her father's cold, accusing eyes, and always, the wind carrying screams that refused to be forgotten. Morning brought no comfort. Claire couldn't shake the feeling of dread that clung to her like a second skin. She needed answers, and she knew where to start. Her grandmother's old house had been abandoned for years, left to rot on the edge of town, near the forest where the wind seemed strongest. It had been the last place Claire had seen her grandmother alive. The thought of going back filled her with unease, but she had no choice. If there were any clues to be found, they would be there. The house greeted her with a creak as she pushed open the door. Dust motes danced in the thin beams of sunlight that pierced the darkness, and the air was thick with the scent of decay and memories. Claire's footsteps echoed in the empty rooms as she moved through the house, searching for anything that might explain the wind and the horrors it carried. It was in the attic that she found a small, leather-bound diary tucked away in an old trunk. Her grandmother's handwriting was delicate but firm. The ink faded with time. Claire's hands trembled as she flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning the words that revealed a story she had never known. Her grandmother had lived through a time of great tragedy in Willow Creek, a time when the town had been gripped by fear and desperation. The wind had carried screams even then, and the townsfolk had been driven to make a pact, one that would silence the past and bury their sins. They had bound the screams to the wind, trapping the souls of the lost, but in doing so, they had cursed themselves. The diary didn't detail the specifics of the pact, but it hinted at something dark, something that had stained the town's history and the Donovan family's legacy. Claire's blood ran cold as she realized her grandmother had been part of it. The wind wasn't just a force of nature, it was a prison for the town's darkest secrets. But what terrified Claire the most was the last entry in the diary, written in a shaky hand. The wind is restless. The screams are getting louder. They want to be free, and they will come for us all. The wind howled outside, as if in response. Claire's heart raced as she clutched the diary to her chest. She had uncovered the first clue, but it brought more questions than answers. Town had made a pact to silence the past, but at what cost? And why was the wind turning against her now? As she left the house, the wind whipped around her, harsh and unforgiving. It carried faint whispers that seemed to mock her, daring her to dig deeper. The town felt different now, more hostile. People she had known all her life avoided her gaze, their eyes filled with suspicion and fear. Even Ethan had grown distant, his warnings more urgent, more desperate. "Claire, you need to stop this," he told her one evening, his voice tense. "You're stirring things up that should stay buried." The wind, it's not just wind, Claire. It knows. And it doesn't like what you're doing. But Claire couldn't stop. The diary had unlocked something inside her, a need to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. Yet, with every step forward, the wind grew stronger, more malevolent. It was as if it had become a living entity, a force that sought to crush her under the weight of its secrets. And in the dead of night, when the wind screamed through the trees, Claire began to wonder if she was losing her grip on reality. The wind wasn't just a harbinger of doom, it was a warning. But would she heed it, or would she be its next victim? Chapter 4. The Forgotten Tragedy. The wind was relentless. It howled through the night, tearing at the windows of Claire's childhood home as if it wanted to rip the entire structure from its foundation. The whispers had grown louder, no longer just faint murmurs, but full-throated screams. Sleep was impossible. Every time Claire closed her eyes, she saw their faces shadowy figures, their mouths open in silent agony, their eyes pleading for release. But it wasn't just the screams that haunted her now. It was the knowledge she had uncovered in her grandmother's diary, the dark truth that had been buried beneath years of silence. There was a tragedy in Willow Creek's past, a horror that had been smothered by the wind and forgotten by the living. Yet, the spirits of the dead had never truly left. They were trapped, bound to the wind that carried their cries for vengeance. It had happened over a century ago, during the harshest winter the town had ever known. A fire had swept through the town, ignited by a spark in one of the oldest houses near the edge of the forest. The blaze had consumed everything in its path, killing dozens of townsfolk, including women and children who had been unable to escape the flames. The survivors had blamed the wind, claiming it had fanned the fire, turning it into an unstoppable force of destruction. Desperate and grief-stricken, the townspeople had made a pact. They had called upon a local mystic, a woman with knowledge of dark rituals, to bind the wind and silence the cries of the dead. The ritual had worked at least for a time. The wind had become quieter, its whispers less insistent. But the curse had never truly been lifted. The spirits had been silenced, not freed, and their anger had festered in the heart of the wind. Now, as Claire stood in the center of the abandoned town square, she felt the weight of that history pressing down on her. The wind tugged at her hair, cold and biting, as if trying to pull her into its embrace. She could almost hear their voices, the people who had died in the fire, crying out for justice that had never been served. But the most horrifying realization was that her own family was tied to this tragedy. Her great-grandfather had been one of the town elders who had led the ritual, one of the men who had condemned the spirits to eternal torment in the wind. The guilt of past generations weighed heavily on her now, and she wondered if her return to Willow Creek had stirred the spirits from their restless slumber. The wind seemed to know her thoughts, responding with a ferocious gust that nearly knocked her off her feet. She stumbled, catching herself against the weathered wood of a building. The sky had darkened, and the air was thick with tension. The wind wasn't just angry, it was desperate, as if it knew its time was running out. Back at her house, things grew even stranger. Objects moved on their own, pushed by unseen forces. The temperature dropped to freezing, even though it was the middle of summer. Claire's breath fogged the air as she wandered through rooms that felt increasingly hostile, each shadow hiding something sinister. The wind outside howled louder, the screams within it growing more distinct, more personal. She recognized the voices, now people she had once known, family members long gone, their cries mingling with those of the forgotten townsfolk. They called her name, pleading for her to end their suffering, to free them from the wind's cursed grasp. Claire knew she had to find a way to break the curse, but every step forward made her feel more isolated, more hunted. The wind was everywhere, its malevolent presence pressing in on her from all sides. It wanted something from her, something she wasn't sure she could give. And as the night deepened, Claire began to wonder if she could survive long enough to find out what it was. Chapter 5. The Wind's Wrath. The wind no longer whispered, it screamed. It tore through Willow Creek with a vengeance, ripping roofs off houses and hurling debris through the streets. The trees that had once stood as sentinels along the town's edge were now uprooted, their massive trunks crashing to the ground like fallen giants. The air was filled with a deafening roar, punctuated by the piercing screams of spirits long forgotten. But those screams weren't just in the wind anymore. They echoed inside Claire's mind, relentless and suffocating. She crouched in the corner of her living room, hands clamped over her ears, trying to shut out the cacophony. But there was no escaping it. The voices were too loud, too insistent. They clawed at her consciousness, demanding to be heard, demanding retribution. The wind battered the walls of the house, shaking it to its foundation. Windows shattered, sending shards of glass skittering across the floor. Claire flinched as the cold wind rushed in, biting at her skin. The temperature plummeted, turning her breath into visible puffs of mist. It felt like the wind had a will of its own, a malevolent force intent on destroying everything in its path. And at the center of it all, Claire knew, was the curse her family had helped create. She had tried to uncover the truth, to piece together the mystery of Willow Creek's tragic past. But now, as the wind lashed out with unchecked fury, she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. Perhaps some things were meant to stay buried. Perhaps the wind was too powerful, too angry to be stopped. But as despair threatened to take hold, Claire remembered the final entries in her grandmother's diary. There had been hints, vague and cryptic, about a way to end the curse. A ritual, a sacrifice. It was their only hope, but it came at a great cost. She didn't know if she had the strength to do what was required. The townspeople had once dismissed her as just another outsider who would eventually leave Willow Creek behind. But now, with the wind tearing their world apart, they turned to her with desperate eyes. They had heard the whispers, seen the signs. They knew she was the key to stopping the wind, even if they didn't understand how or why. Ethan was the first to find her, braving the storm to reach her house. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "Claire," he shouted over the wind's roar, "we can't take much more of this. You've got to do something." "I'm trying," Claire yelled back, though her voice sounded small against the wind's fury. She showed him the diary, the faded pages that held the town's dark secrets. There's a way to end it, but it's dangerous. It requires a sacrifice. Ethan's expression darkened. What kind of sacrifice? Claire hesitated, the weight of her decision pressing down on her like a vise. She hadn't wanted to believe it, hadn't wanted to accept what the diary implied. But there was no other way. To end the curse, someone had to willingly give themselves to the wind, to the spirits it carried. Only then would the past be silenced and the wind's wrath be stilled. "I have to go to the forest," she said, her voice trembling. "To the place where it all started. I have to face them, the spirits. And I have to offer myself." No. Ethan's grip tightened on her arm. There has to be another way. But deep down, Claire knew there wasn't. The wind was growing more violent by the second, and the screams were becoming unbearable. If she didn't act soon, the entire town would be obliterated. The screams in the wind were louder now, filled with a desperate hunger. The spirits demanded justice, and they would stop at nothing until they got it. With a steely resolve, Claire pulled away from Ethan. "I have to do this," she said, her voice firm despite the terror gnawing at her insides. "It's the only way." And as she stepped out into the raging storm, the wind seemed to pause for a moment, as if recognizing her decision. The screams quieted, replaced by an eerie silence that hung heavy in the air. The wind knew she was coming. It was ready for her. Chapter 6. The Final Revelation. The forest loomed ahead, dark and foreboding, as the wind whipped through the trees with a violent intensity that matched the pounding of Claire's heart. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if the earth itself was trying to hold her back. The spirits knew she was coming, and the wind, once merely a whisper, was now a full-throated roar, filled with the cries of the damned. Claire clutched her grandmother's diary tightly against her chest, the brittle pages now stained with sweat and fear. The final entries had revealed the awful truth. Her grandmother, the woman she had idolized, was one of the key figures who had sealed the spirits in the wind. It had been her hand that completed the ritual, her voice that spoke the incantation that bound the souls of the dead to eternal torment. And now, those same souls demanded retribution. As she reached a clearing in the forest, the same place where the original ritual had been performed over a century ago, Claire felt a cold dread settle in her bones. The air here was different, thicker somehow, as if it carried the weight of 1,000 regrets. The wind circled around her, a swirling vortex of rage and sorrow, its icy fingers brushing against her skin. This was where it had all begun, and this was where it would end. She opened the diary to the final page, the inked words blurred with time, but still legible. The ritual her grandmother had performed was not just to silence the spirits, it was to protect the town from their wrath. But the price had been steep, and the guilt had eaten away at her grandmother until the day she died. Now, it was Claire's turn to face the consequences. The wind howled louder, the voices within it growing more distinct, more accusatory. They didn't just want freedom, they wanted justice. They wanted the truth to be acknowledged, the sins of the past to be confronted. Claire realized, with a sinking feeling, that she wasn't here just to release them. She was here to reckon with what had been done. The wind suddenly shifted, and the spirits began to take shape. Shadows coalesced into figures, their forms wavering like smoke. Faces twisted in anguish appeared before her, eyes burning with a mixture of hatred and desperation. They moved toward her, a wall of spectral rage, their voices merging into one terrifying chorus. "Why?" Claire's breath caught in her throat. She had no answer. What could she say that would ease their suffering? What words could undo a century of torment? But then she remembered the final clue in the diary. It wasn't just about releasing the spirits. It was about confronting the truth. With trembling hands, Claire began to speak, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. She recounted the tragedy that had been buried, the fire that had taken so many lives, and the pact that had silenced their cries for justice. She confessed her family's role in the ritual, acknowledged the pain it had caused. The spirits paused, their forms flickering like dying embers. The wind seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Claire swallowed hard, the final words catching in her throat. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." For a moment, nothing happened. The wind hung heavy in the air, the spirits staring at her with unblinking eyes. Then, slowly, the wind began to shift, the howling dying down to a low murmur. The spirits' faces softened, the anger in their eyes fading into something resembling peace. But there was one last demand. Claire felt it in her bones, the final sacrifice they required. Justice couldn't be achieved with words alone. The wind circled her again, not with the fury of before, but with a solemn, expectant stillness. It wanted one last thing, her life, in exchange for theirs. Tears streamed down Claire's face as she nodded, accepting her fate. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, the wind wrapping around her like a cold embrace. The screams quieted, and the wind finally stilled. Chapter 7: The Sacrifice. The silence that followed was suffocating. The wind, once a relentless force, had stilled, leaving only the quiet rustle of leaves and the heavy weight of anticipation in the air. Claire stood alone in the clearing, her heart pounding as the spirits surrounded her, their ghostly forms flickering in and out of existence. They were waiting, watching, their spectral eyes locked on her every move. The final sacrifice. The realization settled over her like a cold, damp shroud. The spirits wouldn't rest until they had their justice, and justice meant giving them what they'd been denied for so long, an end to the pain. The torment, the endless cries carried on the wind. Claire knew what she had to do. Her grandmother had made a pact to protect the town, but that pact had only delayed the inevitable. The curse had persisted, feeding on the unspoken guilt and unresolved anger of the past. She glanced down at the diary in her hands, the worn pages a reminder of the family legacy she had inherited. The words within had guided her here to this moment of reckoning, but they couldn't tell her what to do next. That decision was hers alone. The spirits began to move closer, their forms becoming more defined, more real. Their faces, once contorted with rage, now held something else, an expectant sorrow. They had suffered, yes, but they were also tired. Tired of the endless cycle, tired of the wind that carried their screams across time. They needed release, and Claire was the only one who could give it to them. The wind picked up again, but this time it wasn't violent. It was a gentle breeze, cool and soothing as it brushed against her skin. The spirits' voices whispered in her ears, a low murmur that rose and fell like the tide. They were calling to her, urging her forward. Claire took a deep breath and stepped into the center of the clearing. The wind swirled around her, lifting her hair and tugging at her clothes. The spirits closed in, their presence both comforting and terrifying. She could feel their pain, their desperation, and it mirrored her own. She had been running from the past for so long, but now there was nowhere left to run. She had to face it head on. "I'm ready," she whispered, her voice trembling but resolute. "I'll do what you ask." The wind responded with a soft, almost mournful sigh. The spirits' forms began to shimmer, their edges blurring as they drew closer. Claire closed her eyes, bracing herself for what was to come. She didn't know what the sacrifice would entail, whether it would be her life, her soul, or something else entirely, but she knew it was necessary. The only way to end the curse was to give herself to the wind, to the spirits, and trust that they would find peace. For a moment, nothing happened. The wind swirled around her, carrying with it the faint echoes of the past. She could hear the voices of the spirits, their cries growing softer, more distant. And then, suddenly, the wind shifted. It wasn't just a breeze anymore. It was a force, pulling her, tugging at her very essence. Claire felt a sharp, searing pain in her chest, as if the wind was tearing something from within her. She gasped, doubling over as the pain intensified. But she didn't fight it. She let it come, surrendering to the inevitable. The spirits needed her, and she would give them everything. The wind howled one final time, a deafening roar that seemed to shake the very earth beneath her feet. Claire cried out, her voice lost in the tempest, and then silence. The wind stopped. The spirits faded into, their forms dissolving like mist in the morning sun. Claire collapsed to the ground, her body trembling, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She could feel the cold earth beneath her, the weight of the world pressing down on her. But the wind was gone. The screams had finally stopped. As she lay there, staring up at the sky, Claire felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. The sacrifice had been made. The spirits were free. And for the first time in years, Willow Creek was silent. The town had been waiting, and now the waiting was over. But as Claire's vision began to blur, and the world around her faded into darkness, she couldn't help but wonder, had she done enough? Had the curse truly been lifted? Only time would tell. Chapter 8. The Wind's Echo. Willow Creek had never been so quiet. The once constant howling of the wind had faded, leaving the town shrouded in eerie stillness. The townspeople, long accustomed to the relentless wails that haunted their nights, now found themselves unnerved by the silence. It was as if the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to break the uneasy calm. Weeks had passed since that fateful night in the forest. Townsfolk spoke in hushed whispers, their voices carrying a mix of relief and fear. The wind had changed, yes, but at what cost? No one knew for sure what had happened to Claire Donovan. Some said she had left town, driven away by the horrors she uncovered. Others believed she had perished in the storm, her body swallowed by the very wind she had sought to tame. But a few whispered that Claire had become something else, entirely a part of the wind, bound to it forever, just like the spirits she had tried to free. Ethan stood at the edge of the clearing, where the trees swayed gently in the breeze. The forest, once so menacing, now seemed almost serene. The memories of what had transpired here felt distant, like a bad dream that lingered at the edge of his consciousness. Yet, as he listened to the rustling leaves, he couldn't shake the feeling that the past wasn't quite finished with them. He knelt down, his fingers brushing the cold earth where Claire had made her final stand. The ground felt different here, as if it held a residual energy, a connection to what had come before. Ethan closed his eyes and listened. For a long moment, there was nothing, just the soft rustling of leaves and the occasional chirp of a distant bird. Then, just as he was about to rise, he heard it. Faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. A whisper on the wind. It wasn't the tortured screams of the past, nor the vengeful cries of the spirits. It was something softer, more peaceful, a voice, barely audible, calling his name. Then, his breath caught in his throat. He looked around, searching for the source, but there was no one. The trees remained still, the forest quiet. But the wind, it carried an echo, a lingering trace of something that once was. Claire, he wanted to believe it was her, a final farewell, a sign that she had found peace. But deep down, he wasn't sure. The town began to rebuild in the aftermath, the residents cautiously returning to their routines. The winds had changed, but the scars remained. Buildings were repaired, graves tended to, but the weight of the past still lingered in the air. People spoke of moving forward, but their eyes held the shadows of what they'd endured. As the days turned into weeks, the story of Claire Donovan and the cursed wind became a part of Willow Creek's folklore. Children whispered about it in the schoolyard, daring one another to venture into the forest. Elders told the tale with a solemn nod, their voices tinged with respect and fear. And yet, the wind remained quiet. But on some nights, when the town lay still and the moon hung low in the sky, the wind would stir, just for a moment. It would rustle the leaves and sweep through the streets with a faint, almost imperceptible sound, like a distant cry carried from far away. Most would dismiss it as nothing more than the wind, a natural phenomenon with no meaning. But those who had been in Willow Creek long enough knew better. The past had been silenced, but it was never truly forgotten. The wind carried memories, echoes of a time when screams filled the air. And while the town healed, a part of it would always remember. For as long as the wind blew through Willow Creek, there would always be that faint, haunting echo, a reminder that some things could never be buried, only quieted. And somewhere, far in the distance, the wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it a whisper of the past, a promise that it would never be entirely gone. The wind carried the screams, still,